Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
They say everything works out for the best, and I suppose that's true for me too, but it sure was rough getting here. My name is Evan Clark. I'm a pretty average guy in many ways, 5 feet 6 inches, 155 pounds, with dark brown hair and blue eyes. I'm more of an observer at parties than the life of the party. I never quite know who to talk to, or what to say to keep people entertained. I was in the Army when I met Rachel. I had a rare weekend pass, one of my last few weekends at foot binning, which I jokingly called the summer resort for boys. The real nickname was Binning School for Boys, better known as Officer Candidate School, OCS. If you've ever seen an officer and a gentleman, it was basically the Army's version of that. But I'm getting off track. A couple of buddies and I decided to escape Columbus for the weekend and check out Atlanta. Naturally, as red-blooded soon-to-be lieutenants, we headed straight for Buckhead. It took us a while to find it since none of us knew the city, but when we did, we wasted no time enjoying the sights and sounds of the local scene. We started the night at the ESPN zone, grabbing a couple of beers and competing in the sports arcade games for about an hour. It was hard to focus because we kept pointing out one girl after another, but that was the whole point of being there, right? We didn't really expect to get anywhere with the girls, especially with our freshly shaved heads. But luck was on our side. Just after leaving the ESPN zone, Robert and I literally bumped into two very attractive women on the sidewalk. We were busy arguing about the last round of the quarterback game when we collided with them. Robert, being 6 feet 3 inches, didn't need to be as studly as me to make an impression. The two women were just as distracted by their conversation. Janice was about 5 feet 4 inches and probably around 120 pounds, with platinum blonde hair, blue eyes, and a sweet smile. But Rachel had dark auburn hair, stood about 5 feet 6 inches, and weighed maybe 130 pounds. What really got me were her green eyes and her amazing legs. God, I love summer. Robert and I opted to insult them for not paying attention to where they were going as our approach. It was a risky move, but again, luck was on our side, since they both laughed and gave it right back to us. We stood on the sidewalk and talked and laughed for about 45 minutes before someone finally suggested that we find a place to sit down and have a beer. It turns out that both Janice and Rachel cut hair at one of local sports clips franchises, so they noticed our buzz cuts, and that started us on the great times to be had in the U.S. Army and, in OCS in particular. They teased us about our need to let them cut it next time, so it wouldn't get ruined and force us into cutting it all off. To make a long story a little bit shorter, Robert and Janice continued to see one another when they could, as did Rachel and I. Rachel was everything. Or at least realistically everything I could have ever wanted in a girlfriend. She was gorgeous, smart, attentive, and fun. She seemed to enjoy sex, though she was a little reserved about what she liked to do. Oh, well, there are more important things in life, right? And I wasn't being denied. She didn't seem to have a problem with the time we had to spend in the field and always seemed glad to see me when we got back in. After OCS, I stayed at Foot Binning for Infantry Officers Basic Course, or IOBC as we called it, and spent even more time in the field along with a lot of very painful time in Building 4. Building Snore, did I say that? Was the building in which all the classroom instruction took place, and it was very hard to stay awake as very dry instructors of the captain and sergeant first-class ilk droned on incessantly. However, I digressed again. As IOBC started to wind down, Rachel and I obviously had to make a decision about our relationship. I had grown to love her, and I thought she probably felt the same way, though we had never exchanged that sentiment. I decided to take her someplace nice for dinner over the weekend and tell her how I felt and try to see if we had a future together. We went to dinner at Nick's Fish Market in Atlanta, and yes, making that drive from Columbus constantly was beating me down. The food was fantastic, and the service was impeccable. We ordered dessert, and I finally got up the nerve to ask Rachel about how she felt. Rachel, we've been seeing one another for a few months now, and it has been great. As you know, I'm going to be transferred soon to Fort Riley, Kansas, so I guess I'd like to find out where we stand with one another. I have grown to love you, and would love it if you would consider going with me. I know the middle of nowhere Kansas can't really compete with Atlanta, but I'm hoping if you feel the same for me, or if you could get there, the location won't matter as much. Oh, Evan. Yes, I love you. As for going with you to Fort Riley, I'd like nothing better, and maybe you've already implied as much and I just don't want to make too many assumptions. But, do you see us as eventually getting married? I don't want to put any pressure on you or anything, but I really need to know if you feel like we could be headed there before I uproot my wild life to move with you. Of course that was reasonable. Rachel had grown up in Atlanta. All her friends and family were here. When I professed my love, I was by default saying that I assumed we'd get married sooner or later if she felt the same way. I guess not everyone thinks that way, though. Of course, honey. I'm so sorry not to have clarified that better. I have never told any woman before that I loved them. I certainly assume that we're headed for marriage if you feel the same way. Then, it's settled. This is so exciting. I can't wait to tell Janice. Needless to say, we had a great night of sex that night. A couple of months later, we had moved to Manhattan, Kansas, and I was hip-deep involved in the training cycle since our battalion was going to deploy to the National Training Center, NTC, for our biggest and most important combat exercises and evaluations soon. Rachel had no problem, of course, finding a job since you can find a sports clips, great clips, or something similar hiring almost anywhere. We found a nice apartment and Rachel did a great job of making it into a home for us with very little help from me. I got along great with Captain Reynolds, my company commander, and even more importantly, with my platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Donovan. Sergeant Donovan's deeply tan-lined facial features, sitting on 5 feet 11 inches of muscle and gnarly manner demanded respect. For those that may not know, the more experienced non-commissioned officers pride themselves on being the backbone of the Army. Not only are they responsible for leading soldiers and fire teams and squads, but the more senior NCOs are responsible for helping the officers lead platoons, companies, and above, as well as training young new officers. Bad NCOs can make your life miserable. Good ones are worth their weight in gold. As I have already inferred, I had a good one as my second in charge and my mentor. The only real challenge I had in acclimating was with the company's supply sergeant. Sergeant Sullivan was a huge guy at 6 feet 4 inches and a weight that was proportionate. He was always in the gym and had the arms, back, and chest to show it. He was all about his upper body, though. He did nothing to develop his legs, and he never did any cardiovascular work. He was also one of those guys that always seemed to have a profile, so he couldn't run for PT. When someone in the Army is sick or hurt, or if they want to get out of something, they are required to show up for morning formation like everyone else, but then are allowed to go to sick call. At sick call, they wait for their chance to see the battalion PA and be treated. There are those, unfortunately, who will work the system to avoid having to run or do other kinds of training they don't like. Sergeant Sullivan only liked to exert himself to build his upper body, so he was often busy running profiles, which allowed him not to participate in any training involving running. He also often found a way to stay out of the field training exercises. I guess I didn't hide my opinion of Sergeant Sullivan very well, and, as a result, he made life tough on me whenever he could, which, because he held the role of supply sergeant, was often. Whenever we needed almost anything, we had to work with him to get it. If nothing else, Sergeant Sullivan would always refer to me as LT. That was how enlisted soldiers, and particularly NCOs with little respect for officers and or military courtesy, would address lieutenants in order to avoid calling them sir, or at least lieutenant. There were some, in fairness, who used that terminology and didn't mean it as discourteous, but Sergeant Sullivan wasn't among that group. Rachel and I had been at Fort Riley about 2 months when I decided that it was obvious we would and should get married. It was easy, since we had pretty much decided before moving here. I did try to make the official proposal as romantic as possible by taking her to the lake for a picnic one weekend afternoon in the fall. It was a great day, and we made love right there on the picnic blanket. It didn't take much to plan a wedding for a couple of reasons. Our training calendar wouldn't allow us to get married in Atlanta anytime soon. Rachel wanted to get married as quickly as possible, which pleased me. Obviously, some of the other lieutenants in my battalion, along with Sergeant First Class Reynolds, comprised my wedding party, and there was no need for tuxes since we all wore our blues. Rachel had Janice come from Atlanta to be her maid of honor, but some of the friends she had made at work and the family support groups served as her wedding party. We got married in late October on a beautiful fall Saturday and spent a wonderful and relaxing weekend in Crown Center in downtown Kansas City, which was a couple of hours' drive away. I had to be back for the company lanes training exercise on Monday morning, so it was a short honeymoon with promises to one another to take a real one after our battalion's NTC rotation in February. Married life wasn't a lot different since we had already been living together. I have always been pretty laid back in relationships and was no different in my marriage. Most things just aren't that big a deal to me, and I was happy to let Rachel make decisions on decorating, social calendar, etc. She seemed to enjoy doing it, so things were great. Our sex life predictably picked up to a frenzy for a few weeks, but then started to drop off to something less than it had been prior to getting married. Additionally, Rachel really didn't initiate anymore, which was a change because she used to initiate about most of the time. Thinking back, that was about the time that Rachel started to treat me in a subtly different manner. I was, and always had been, fine with her taking the initiative on many things in our relationship, but she started to treat me with what I can only describe as a lack of respect. Those couple of nuances were lost on me at the time because I was working so hard to make a good impression on the LTC Lieutenant Colonel Ryan was the battalion commander as well as my senior raider, so his opinion of my work would significantly impact my career. It was during our Table 8 gunnery qualifications in early January that I found out for sure what should have been obvious to me for at least the last month or so. We ran out of kerosene for the heating stoves in the tent we used for our company CP, command post. I'll give you 3 guesses who should have made sure we had plenty of kerosene. But then you wouldn't need them, would you? Of course, the stellar NCO in question wasn't in the field with us. He was on profile, and therefore was in the rear detachment group. CPT Reynolds asked me to go to the rear and get some kerosene. This was kind of a mixed bag because I could stop in at my platoon CP in the rear and give Rachel a quick call to tell her I loved her, but it was also a gopher assignment, so that part really sucked. In fairness, my platoon had just fired, so I was the logical choice to go, and the CPT certainly did not intend it as an indictment of my value to the unit in the field. It took about 30 minutes to get to the rear and another 10 for my driver, Private First Class Johnson, and I to find the kerosene, but it was locked up in the company supply area. It should have been, so that was no big deal. I told Johnson to go and find Sergeant Sullivan, who should have been in the company area, but was not, and I went to my platoon CP in the barracks building next door. I heard voices coming from my CP when I got almost to the door. There shouldn't have been anyone in there, so I quietly walked up close to the door and heard the voices of both Sergeant Sullivan and my ever-adoring wife, Rachel. Rachel had never been so vocal when she and I made love, but then I guess they weren't making love. They were having sex. I listened long enough to hear some of what they were saying. It was the definition of cliché. Both Sergeant Sullivan and Rachel were belittling me, and both were singing the praises of his massive tool. For 10 minutes I stood there and listened. I was hurt, of course, but more than that, I was embarrassed and I was furious. I made a couple of very quick decisions after that few minutes. First, and probably needless to say, my short-tenured marriage was over. Second, I wasn't going to allow that to adversely impact my career. At least not based on a decision made in haste, or when I was this angry. They couldn't be in there much longer, and I definitely wanted to wait to let them both know they had been found out in my own time and way. I went back downstairs and found Johnson waiting for me by the Hummer. He told me that he hadn't found Sergeant Sullivan. I decided to have a little fun at that point. I told Johnson that I needed a field manual for my desk and gave him the key to the platoon CP. I told him I'd go look in the battalion area for Sergeant Sullivan. He was back in about 10 minutes with a very nervous-looking Sergeant Sullivan. "Sir, Sergeant Sullivan was in our CP. He said that he thought he might find some acetate there. In the Army, acetate is often used as overlays on maps. Did you find what you needed, Sergeant?" "No, sir. I'll see if 3rd Platoon has any in their CP." The Sergeant Major asked me if we had any. Interesting. He had never called me sir before. It was always LT, unless the commander happened to be around. Then it was Lieutenant. "Well, before you do that, help Johnson get some kerosene loaded up in the Hummer. Let's make it enough to last the rest of the week this time. Okay?" "Yes, sir." Twice in 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, Johnson and I were on our way back to the Multi-Purpose Range Complex, MPRC. Johnson never mentioned my wife having been in the CP, or even having seen her. I wondered if she happened to get out, hide, or if I was the only one that didn't know about this. I thought about what to do the rest of the week. I hope I did well with my work responsibilities. If anyone thought otherwise, they didn't comment. I came to a couple of conclusions. I would ask for a transfer out of the battalion. I thought the battalion and brigade commanders would probably approve it under the circumstances. Military wives cheat on occasion, of course, but not usually with someone from within the unit, and very seldom with someone of lower rank. I would divorce Rachel, of course. I didn't want to miss the NTC rotation coming up, though. I talked to all those I needed to when we got back from gunnery, obviously using the proper chain of command. I was gratified that they were more than willing to do what I asked. Simply put, to transfer me to another battalion, but not until after NTC, and not to say anything to anyone until the time was right. For all I know, Sergeant Sullivan and Rachel continued to see one another and have sex with one another every chance they got. I was somewhat surprised and very pleased that after the initial shock, I continued to feel anger to some extent, but very little hurt. If she would betray me that way, she really didn't matter to me at all. It was interesting how her demeanor continued to change at home. She treated me almost with disdain, and we obviously didn't have sex anymore. I don't know what I'd do if she asked for it. I certainly wouldn't have it, but I didn't have to worry about that because she was clearly not interested, which was fine with me. Our NTC rotation was very successful. The OPFOR, opposing force, kicked our butts in every fight as they always do, but we learned a lot, and the OCs, evaluators, told us that we performed much better than almost any other battalion. I was awarded a coin by the OCs as a result of the performance of my platoon in a particular mission, and I was very gratified because no other lieutenant got one. My platoon celebrated in a very robust manner when I told them about it. Of course, even though it was awarded to me, it was really a group effort and I told them so. I got CPT Reynolds to let us take a couple of hours off from vehicle recovery, and we walked to the bowling center and had a great time drinking beers and bowling even if we were in our BDUs. I won't lie. I was kind of fun to have the MPs serve Rachel with divorce papers when I got back, and to see Sergeant Sullivan served with a field-grade Article 15, which effectively started his career in a slow death track. Rachel was, for some reason, very surprised and mad. She denied her affair initially, but when I pointed out to her that it was not going to do her any good to be upset about it or lie about it, she softened considerably. I explained, first, that it wasn't going to make a difference, and that she was apparently fuming simply because she was mad and embarrassed at having been caught. I was past the initial hurt, and my anger had subsided at least a little bit by this time. I was apathetic about her thoughts and feelings on the matter. Second, I reminded her that Sergeant Sullivan was single and a divorce for her meant that she could be with him. I had a feeling that she wouldn't be as excited by that prospect in the long term as she would be in the short term. Anyone that would approach his career in the manner that Sergeant Sullivan did was highly suspect relationship material in my opinion. Obviously, the same is true of any soldier who would screw another soldier's wife. But as I previously indicated, I didn't really care. It was interesting that she seemed to take my comments to heart and show only what I assume she considered to be the minimum acceptable level of contrition while seeming to make plans for her new future at the same time. I transferred to another battalion and was lucky enough to land with a great group of soldiers with whom I could work. 6 years later, I was coming out of a nice restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina. My beautiful wife, Ivy, and I had just celebrated our second anniversary and found out that we were expecting our first child. Yes, I had met Ivy a couple of years after my divorce in Wiesbaden, Germany. She is very petite at 5 feet 1 inch with raven-colored hair, blue eyes, and an incredible body. She was and is everything a man could hope for in a wife. Most importantly, loyal. We had come up from Fayetteville for the evening and had since decided to spend the night in a nice hotel, since we were on another of those great weekends where the division commander turns every 3-day weekend into a 4-day weekend. Ivy and I, being fans of Starbucks, decided to stop and have a latte. It was a beautiful evening, so we decided to sit outside. It was next to a bar, but the noise wasn't that bad and we were enjoying our lattes and each other's company when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around and who do you think I saw but Sergeant Sullivan? Well, he was actually Private First Class Sullivan when he was transferred to Foot Bragg from what I had heard. He and his lovely wife, Rachel, were having a discussion of sorts. Sullivan appeared to be the bouncer at the bar next door to us, and Rachel was standing on the sidewalk next to a beat-up car that was still running and the door was open. I couldn't tell what it was about, but Ivy could tell I was interested. So I told her who the couple was and her eyes and mouth got wide. It was then that Sullivan and Rachel seemed to simultaneously notice us. Rachel's eyes lit up and Sullivan smiled, but it was one of those that you knew wasn't friendly. They both walked our direction. Sullivan was the first to speak. Well, if it isn't the chicken. How are you, LT, or should I say Evan? Since I'm not in the Army anymore, there is no reason to pretend to have any respect for someone that obviously can't keep his woman satisfied. Stop it, Lenny, said Rachel. Lenny, as his name apparently was, just pushed her aside and honed right in on Ivy. Well, little lady, would you like to see what a real man is like? Lenny addressed her directly. Obviously, this infuriated me, but I still tried not to make a scene and stayed seated. Evan is more man than you'll ever be and as much as I'll ever need. I don't want to be rude, but clearly there is nothing for any of us to discuss, so maybe the two of you should go ahead with whatever it was you were doing, responded Ivy. That's my girl. I thought to myself. That should give us one final chance of getting out of this without making a scene, but that was wishful thinking. Lenny moved around toward Ivy, and I had had enough. I pushed my chair back and punched him in the stomach as he swung but missed me. My quick punch both surprised him and knocked the wind out of him. I shouted over my shoulder for Ivy to get to the car, and she did so. With her on the way from the scene and Lenny starting to recover, I unleashed several punches in combination on him. He was as big as ever, but much too slow to be able to effectively counter. Finally, he fell in a heap on the sidewalk. Wow, said Rachel. What? I never knew you had that in you. I wish I had known before. Oh well, so your stud isn't in the Army anymore, huh? No. She hung her head and then started to break down. He got chaptered out shortly after we got to Foot Bragg. I'm so sorry, Evan. Can you ever forgive me? Why didn't you fight for me the way you just did for that woman? I thought you were a chicken. Why? Because I let you make a lot of decorating decisions and treated you kindly? Rachel, I did that because I saw you enjoy doing it, and it just wasn't that important to me. Let me guess, Sullivan. Sorry, I'll always think of him as Sullivan. Helped you with your thinking that I was a chicken? Evan, I can see you're with someone now. I have to be honest and say that my life has been pretty miserable since you divorced me. I just wish I had seen what I had when I had it. At the time, I just found the sex with Lenny more exciting than I did with you. I let that cloud my mind and forget two pretty important things. One of those being that comparing new and illicit sex to sex with someone with whom I've been with for a period of time is not a fair comparison because it's always going to seem more exciting at first. Second, that sex is just one aspect of a relationship, and learn the hard way that it's no more important than the other facets of making a relationship great. You always treated me amazingly well. In a way, that contributed to all this because I, consciously or subconsciously, thought that's how I'd be treated in any relationship. I hadn't let myself get close enough to anyone before to know how great I had it with you. I don't suppose that, if I left Lenny... The start of her question hung in the air for a moment before I could figure a way to answer. I felt sorry for her, and wanted to hurt her at the same time if that's possible. Rachel, I have to be honest with you. Part of me is very glad you haven't been happy. You see, I never told you, but I heard you and Lenny screwing in my platoon CP when you thought I was in the field several years ago. I heard the things you said to one another, and could tell you relished in doing things with him that you had denied me. I could see in some circumstances how a one-time indiscretion could occur, but you kept going back again and again. That took making a planned decision to betray me over and over again. In doing so, you demonstrated not only a lack of love, but a lack of respect for me. That I could never get past. Finally, the fact that you did things with him that you would not do with me was the ultimate in humiliation for me. You may not have meant it that way. You may have just been caught up in the circumstances and found it more exciting or acceptable. You may have just been selfish and wanted two kinds of sexual relationships. However, you thought about it, or didn't. Those actions were as great a display of disrespect and disdain you could possibly have paid to me or to any man. If the manner in which I treated you somehow contributed to a mental or emotional state on your part where you felt that I was something less than you wanted and not worth your love and respect, then it only makes me happier we're not together. In my opinion, anyone worth my love would think and act exactly the opposite of you. After a pause, she thought about it and nodded slightly. Let me answer your other question. I didn't fight for you because you weren't worth fighting for. Ivy was and will always be worth fighting for because I'm the center of her world, and because she'd do the same for me. As we watched the groaning Sullivan, I asked her, "Hope that man keeps you happy for long?" I turned after asking her and walked back to my car and wife, not really expecting an answer or caring about one. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.